You what? It's Thursday, July 13th. This is Africa 54. As the NATO summit ends, U.S. President Joe Biden highlights how Washington and its allies are supporting Ukraine, defending democratic values and taking action to address global challenges. A plea for help is dispatched from a desperate group of Sub-Saharan migrants stranded in a treacherous part of the desert area along the Tunisian-Libyan border. And the future of a Russian-Ukraine agreement to export Ukrainian grain to world markets is again in doubt. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. In a show of NATO's expanding power, U.S. President Joe Biden traveled to Helsinki, where he featured on Thursday's NATO's newest member, Finland, as he closes out a 5-day trip to Europe. Finland became NATO's newest member earlier this year, an entry that effectively doubled the defense alliance's border with Russia. The addition of Finland highlights the growth of NATO that President Biden says has fortified itself since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Before heading to Finland, Biden delivered an address in Lithuania, highlighting how Washington and its allies are supporting Ukraine. VOA White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara has more.
Optimistic resolve for Ukraine?
We will not waver. We will not waver. I mean that. Our commitment to Ukraine will not weaken. We will stand for liberty and freedom today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes.
And a stern warning to Moscow.
Putin still wrongly believes that he can outlast Ukraine. He can't believe it's their land, their country, and their future. And even after all this time, Putin still doubts our staying power. He's still making a bad bet.
Twin messages from U.S. President Joe Biden in his parting words from what he called a historic NATO summit in Lithuania's capital that saw renewed support for Kyiv to join the alliance, but no specific commitments or timeline that Ukraine seeks. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke at the close of the NATO meeting.
I think at the end of summit we had great unity from our leaders and security guarantees that the success for this summit. I think so.
Zelensky, who has crisscrossed the planet in the past year to rally Western support, defended Washington's decision to provide Kyiv with cluster munitions, weapons banned by more than 120 countries for their indiscriminate killing capability.
Russia constantly uses cluster munitions on our territory, fights exclusively on our land, kills our people, and has continuously used cluster munitions for many years.
Biden departed for Helsinki Wednesday evening for a summit with Nordic leaders on Thursday. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Vilnius, Lithuania.
The 31 members of NATO have wrapped up their summit after concluding 2 days of high-level diplomatic meetings. The Defense Alliance agreed to admit Sweden and reassured Ukraine that NATO will continue to support the nation. For more on the just-ended NATO summit, let's go live to Associated Press international correspondent Philip Crowther. Philip, Ukrainian President Zelensky arrived in Vilnius with big NATO ambitions. Did he leave happy?
Well, in the words of US President Joe Biden in Helsinki just a few hours ago, Zelensky, in fact, was happy in the end, but it took quite a while to get there because he did arrive at this NATO summit here in Lithuania pretty frustrated with how negotiations were happening while he was on his way here. He called those negotiations absurd, and he didn't get all that he wanted, and certainly the Ukrainian people didn't get all that they wanted. Many believe that the country deserves now to become the 33rd member of the military alliance. But even Ukrainian President Zelensky clearly admitted to that publicly during his press conference. here in Vilnius that that is simply not going to happen, that Ukraine is not going to become a NATO member while the war with Russia is ongoing. The speed at which Ukraine will become a NATO member is supposed to be quite significant, though, once the war ends. But of course, that still leaves that very open question of how does this war end? And we heard two points of view of this essentially at this NATO summit. The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg saying that it is up to Russia to end this war. It can end it whenever it wants. That's essentially true. And then Ukrainian President Zelensky saying that this war won't be over until Ukraine has got back all of its territory, every single last village. In other words, this is going to take a while until the doors to membership of NATO are truly opened up to Kyiv.
But Zelensky still got further security guarantees. What did they include?
Well, these security guarantees were first presented by the G7 countries on stage here in Vilnius, together with Ukrainian President Zelensky. What they are is essentially a bridge between the current moment and Ukraine becoming a NATO member eventually. Each country, though, will have to come up with its own bilateral agreements, maybe also in groups of countries with Ukraine, as to what exactly they will be providing Kyiv with, what kind of weapons, of course. And Zelensky does leave this NATO summit with some significant promises when it comes to further military aid for Ukraine. He tends to make quite a lot of demands for military aid, logically as well, and has been criticized for that sometimes, for maybe asking a little bit too much, but he tends to get there in the end. Remember that what he wants now and what he and the Ukrainian government have been demanding again and again is fighter jets from the United States, and they are getting closer to getting those, or at least having pilots who are trained on them. There is to be training that begins for those Ukrainian pilots already in the next few months.
And very quickly, Philip, the president is returning home after wrapping up the summit and his last stop in Finland's capital. Will the White House be happy about this trip?
Yeah, it will. It will be happy with what happened here at the NATO summit in Vilnius, and also with that last stop, because it was really designed to celebrate the fact that NATO has already got its 31st member country. That is Finland, precisely where Joe Biden visited, and with, of course, the possibility of another of the countries that was represented there, Sweden, becoming a NATO member also, most likely at some point after October. For those reasons alone, the United States would say that from its point of view, this trip to Europe, and maybe particularly this NATO summit here in Lithuania, were a success.
Philip, excellent reporting as always. Our thanks to you, Philip Crowther of the Associated Press International correspondent, live for us from Lithuania. The United Nations says the bodies of dozens of people allegedly killed by Sudanese paramilitary and allied militia have been uncovered in a mass grave in West Darfur. The UN Human Rights Office says that according to credible information, 87 people were dumped in a grave near the city of Geneina. Meanwhile, on Thursday, Egypt is hosting a summit of Sudan's neighbors in hopes of coming up with mechanisms to peacefully end the 12-week conflict in Sudan. Joseph Siegel, Director of Research at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies in Washington, tells VOA's Carol Van Dam Egypt has a strong incentive to restore stability in Sudan, as more than 250,000 Sudanese refugees have crossed the border into its country.
It's a fair point, but I think given the possible scenario of a fragmented, protracted conflict in Sudan that could spin out of control in a lot of different ways, that is far more threatening immediately to Egypt. And so I think we have to take at face value that it's a genuine attempt by the Egyptians to move things forward. So there aren't going to be any winners. Whoever emerges from this is not going to be the new head of state in Sudan. This is a battle among two generals. They don't have popular support. They don't have international support. And they're not going to get the recognition or the international financing and investment they would need to rebuild Sudan.
That was Joseph Sigo, Director of Research at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, speaking to VOA's Carol Van Dam. A distressing plea for help is emerging from a desperate group of Sub-Saharan migrants stranded in a treacherous desert area along the Tunisian-Libyan border. In a video shared on social media, many of them are crying out for assistance. VOA's Pondiho has more.
Amid escalating racial tensions in Tunisia's port city of Sfax, hundreds of African migrants from sub-Saharan African countries were compelled to flee. On Wednesday, these migrants sent a distress call to Human Rights Watch, who subsequently shared it with the media.
We are so far dying. I'm dying. Please cover my head. They beat me and I'm almost dying here. Please cover my head. I need
Muhammad, a Nigerian migrant, bears witness to the unimaginable hardships faced by over 600 migrants forcefully expelled from Tunisia's port city of Sfax and abandoned in the unforgiving desert heat.
You know, we spent 7 days at the desert there between Libya and Tunisia. You know, like, it was very tough for us really because like we went through a lot, you know, being in the desert for 7 days without no food and water.
The exodus triggered the eruption of racial tensions following the tragic killing of a Tunisian man on July 3rd. The altercation between the locals and migrants precipitated the expulsion of hundreds of sub-Saharan African migrants.
We are not thieves, we are migrants. We are not killers, we are migrants. We are just looking to build up a good life, you know. We are not criminals, we are not thieves, so like...
Permission from the Tunisian authorities has been granted to the Tunisian Red Cross Crescent to rescue hundreds of migrants without food or water. However, the plight of numerous other migrants scattered along the Tunis western border with Algeria is raising concern among human rights organizations. Their fate remains uncertain, highlighting the urgent need for immediate assistance. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
For more insight on the challenges facing sub-Saharan African migrants in Tunisia, I'm joined live via Skype from Washington by Fadil Alireza, founder and editor-in-chief of meshkal.org, an independent news website in English and Arabic covering Tunisia. Fadil, welcome to Africa 54. Fadil, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Sorry, you cut out just a bit earlier.
Well, it's clear the sub-Saharan African migrants in Tunisia are unwanted. As far as authorities are concerned, who can they turn to?
Well, the latest is we've seen that finally the Red Crescent has managed to reach some of these people on the Libyan border, and that they've brought some mattresses. But there's still a group that has been on the Algerian border that people are quite worried about. They haven't been able to reach them, and people are really fearing the worst in that situation. At the same time, we've also have not seen international organizations such as the IOM and other UN agencies taking a lead here. In one case, we had even seen that the IOM, the migration agency of the UN, had actually asked authorities in Tunisia to clear people who had camped out in front of their offices. You know, really, these were people who had been made homeless by what we're seeing as racist policies against migrants who haven't been able to find a housing, who've been kicked out of their homes.
You know, Fadil, many of them, as we had in the report, have been abandoned in the desert between Libya and Tunisia. What does this say about President Kais Saied's leadership?
Yeah, well, although there are some Tunisians who've been trying to help migrants and giving them some water and some food and even shelter, there are also reactionary groups who've been mobilizing to attack migrants, who are seeing them as a threat. And these reactionary elements are, you know, also some of them are within the security forces as well. And it seems that President Kais Saied is really supporting these groups, playing to this sort of base. We've also seen that the president has doubled down, insisted that, you know, the migrants are actually being treated well, even though we're hearing reports that some of them have died from the treatment that they've suffered at the hands of Tunisian authorities.
Any response so far from the African Union or the European Union, as far as you know, so far at this point?
For the most recent one, we haven't seen one, although we did see after President Kais Saied's speech in February, which had actually echoed some of the European far-right great replacement conspiracy theory about demographic change. They had canceled a conference that was going to happen in Tunisia at that time, and they had put out a statement, but since then we haven't seen a response. And same for the European Union, which actually has been sending hundreds of millions of euros to Tunisia to actually control migration within its borders. Something that we've seen actually, there does seem to be control of migration, but it's happening quite violently. And this is also after the visit of the far-right Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, to Tunisia just last month. She made 2 visits where they were promising even more money to Tunisia for migration control.
You know, on your website, you're up to date with the news coming out of Tunisia. Do you think that the economic and political situation in Tunisia has any implications as far as this Sub-Saharan African migrant crisis is concerned?
Yeah, this may be a factor. I mean, Tunisia has really been cut off from international financial markets until it signs an IMF loan deal, which means it's having trouble importing basic goods like wheat and animal feed. So we're seeing shelves that are empty. We're seeing inflation rising, still very high unemployment. And in fact, we've seen not just Africans from other countries who are going through Tunisia to migrate to Europe. We've seen many Tunisians who themselves are feeling quite desperate economically. So it's in this context of economic desperation that we're seeing these tensions flaring between Tunisians and some of the migrants from other countries in Africa who have been passing through, many of them on the way to Europe.
Fadil, many thanks. Fadil Alireza is the founder and editor-in-chief of Meshkal.org. The U.S.-Africa Business Summit is underway in Botswana, organized by the U.S. Corporate Council on Africa in partnership with the government of Botswana. The summit is being attended by U.S. and African private sector executives, international investors, as well as senior government officials. Kondisi Dube has more from Gaborone.
We are outside the Royal Area Conference Center, where the 15th U.S.-Africa Business Summit is taking place. 1,300 delegates drawn from across the continent of Africa and America have gathered here to discuss trade and investment opportunities between Africa and the United States. The aim is to develop stronger trade ties as well as look for new opportunities. The main issue that was discussed today particularly was the issue of the Africa Growth Opportunities Act, known as AGOA, which is expiring in the next 2 years. And the African continent is of the view that this arrangement has been working well for the people of the continent and there is need for it to be renewed. The meeting ends tomorrow with the expectations that there are deals or commitments that will be made for VOA in Gaborone, Botswana. This is Nkondisi.
Still to come, the future of a Russia-Ukraine agreement to export Ukrainian grain appears to be in doubt. We'll explain after the break. Stay with us.
The FIFA Women's World Cup 2023 is set to kick off in Australia and New Zealand. Morocco and Zambia are making their debut, while Nigeria, along with South Africa, make their triumphant return to the tournament. Yet all eyes will not only be on the playing field, but on FIFA itself. On this week's edition of Our Voices, we'll take a closer look at the upcoming Women's World Cup games and see if FIFA will keep its promise to be more inclusive and pay big money to their female players. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Lina Khmoudou, in Washington every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
In other African news, former Mozambique Finance Minister Manuel Chang, who had been held in a South African prison for nearly 5 years, has been extradited to the United States to face a fraud and corruption trial over a $2 billion scandal involving fraudulent government loans. Chang was arrested in Johannesburg in 2018 on a U.S. warrant. A Zimbabwean court has disqualified Xavier Kasukuwere, a former minister and senior ruling party official who fled the country after the 2017 overthrow of former President Robert Mugabe from running in the August presidential election. The decision follows a complaint filed by a member of the ruling ZANU-PF party. The Sudanese People's Liberation Movement in opposition and the other political parties group OPP are demanding that South Sudanese Chief Justice Chan Reach Madut resign for allegedly displaying behavior favoring one signatory of the nation's 2018 peace agreement. Officials accused Madut of revealing his political allegiance by attending the political rally organized by President Salva Kiir's party, the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement. The future of a Russia-Ukraine agreement to export Ukrainian grain to world markets is again in doubt as Moscow threatens to not renew it after it expires on Monday. Dorian Jones reports.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, meeting with Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky this week, pledged his determination to secure a new extension to the Russian-Ukrainian grain deal, which the United Nations and Turkey brokered last year.
I hope that the period of the initiative, which has delivered nearly 33 million tons of grain to the people in need so far, like a windpipe from the Turkish Straits to the world, will be extended again on July 17th.
With Ukraine a major grain supplier, the grain deal has helped to avert a surge in global food prices. But the agreement needs to be renewed every 60 days. Moscow says it will only agree to another extension if international sanctions are eased to allow the export of Russian grain and fertilizer.
Russia is eager to get some more niches to omit the sanction regime for some parts of its economy, for some banks which are connected or related to the agricultural sector, and it's really very eager to smooth or to soften the sanctioning of its economy.
Despite international pressure, Erdogan has maintained close ties with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, and has refused to enforce Western sanctions against Russia. Turkish officials say their relations with Moscow allowed Ankara to broker the grain agreement and warn of the danger of a food crisis if the deal is not extended.
This is very important for global food price will be spike again. It is very important not only for Turkey and the NATO or the other countries where the grain prices will be jump.
Turkey's release Saturday of Ukrainian commanders held as part of a prisoner swap infuriated Moscow. The soldiers were supposed to stay in Turkey until the end of the war as part of the deal brokered by Turkey between Ukraine and Russia. Erdogan is also voicing support for Ukraine's bid to join NATO. By doing that, analysts say Ankara is sending a warning to Moscow over the grain deal.
Turkey really wants the grain deal continue, and the signals were coming from Russia is that the grain deal is coming to an end. So here they decided before Russians take any more action to really end this grain deal, Turkey is sending a signal that there are many things depending on Turkey, including Turkey not joining any sanctions against Russia.
For Erdogan, the grain deal was a diplomatic triumph. If Moscow ends it, observers say there may be questions of how strong a broker he really is. Dorian Jones of VOA News, Istanbul.
The Taliban has ordered women's beauty salons to close in a month. Fakunda Paimani has the story.
Women's activists and watchdogs say that the Taliban's new ban on their businesses will push them further into poverty and isolation. The recent decree mandates that beauty salons shut down in a month, adding to the string of restrictions faced by Afghan women. The Taliban also prohibit women from accessing secondary education, employment, and public spaces. Kabul salon owner Banu Amiri, who did not want to use her real name, fears her family's livelihood will suffer if the ban is implemented.
If I lose my source of income from the beauty salon, I will not be able to pay for my children's education, and my children will remain uneducated. When I cannot work, I will not be able to pay the rent of the house.
There are more than 12,000 women's beauty salons in Afghanistan, and more than 3,000 of them are in Kabul, according to the Afghanistan's Chamber of Commerce and Investment. The ban calls into question the Taliban's promise to allow women to participate in the private sector.
The only way for women to earn money was working in the private sector. With the closing of beauty salons, many women who were the breadwinners of their families lose their job and income, and their lives will become harder and darker.
Heather Barr, Associate Director of Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, worries the ban will result in a significant loss for women in Afghanistan.
This is not about whether you can go and get your hair and nails done. Beauty salons are a women-only space that can offer community and support to women in a situation where they've already lost many other sources of support, including the entire system to deal with domestic violence. So this is actually a devastating loss for women in general.
Banu Amiri and other women like her want the Taliban to reconsider their decision.
Our demand is that they regulate beauty salons but not close them completely. They should not take away our livelihood from us.
The UN has called on the Taliban to withdraw the ban, which it says will impact negatively on the economy and contradicts stated support for women entrepreneurship. Farkhunda Paimani, VOA News, Washington.
And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.